Welcome back to the Rum Ration Podcast, Season 2. This is the podcast for all your military history needs. I'm Colin.
And I'm Rejoy, the second episode of a three-part series exploring French-Canadian participation in the world wars that Canada fought in. That's where we are today. Now, we started off with episode 32, which was Shattering the Myth, French Canadians at War, where we were joined by Richard Garon, whose groundbreaking research challenges the traditional views of French Canadian participation in the First World War.
And we're fortunate also with Julien Lehoux, an expert on the Second World War, specifically focusing on the Quebec Battalion in the Battle of Hong Kong. And Julien is back with us once more to really drill down into the details of that battle and more, I think perhaps more importantly, the absence of any legacy or memorials back in Quebec or Canada, which is kind of why we've titled this The Forgotten Hong Kong, the Quebec's Forgotten Battle. Julien, welcome back to the Rum Ration Podcast. We're thrilled to have you join us.
Well, hello to you too, and thank you very much for welcoming me once again. Just as a heads up, I kind of woke up this morning and I don't feel like it's my good English day today, so I might just have trouble speaking in general. So just bear with me for that episode.
That's absolutely fine. It's always a pleasure to have you.
Well, the pleasure is all mine.
Today we move into the Second World War, where the story of sacrifice became tangled up with politics and memory, culminating in an absence mémoriale of Quebec regarding one of the most tragic battles Canada fought in. Again, it's a very common story, sadly, throughout military history, as we know. So, Julien, thank you for guiding us through your research. And I know Colin has thrown this in on purpose onto my court.
I sure did.
Just waiting for this.
You let me write the script.
Julien, where you might slip into French, I might slip into German.
Very good. Yes, exactly. Yeah.
It's all coming back. Or as I would have said by default, 1941. So
that too.
Well, I'll just believe you on that one. I don't speak German.
Me neither. Sounded convincing. He could have been reading the phone book.
But yes, well, thank you. I'm really happy to talk about this article that I published last year, and to really highlight not only Quebec's participation in that battle, and a battle that is usually very lesser known here in the province, but also hopefully to just highlight some new perspective regarding this battle and our own participation in it.
Thank you, Julien. And where can listeners find that article?
So basically, it's this article was published for I think it's named Études Canadiennes, Canadian Studies, it's just another academic journal. It's open access, so you can just access this on the internet without any paywall or anything like that. I put the link on my personal LinkedIn if you guys want to check out my LinkedIn, or also my academia profile. It's all there, so it's free to
we'll put a link to in the show
everything.
notes so people can find it.
Perfect, great.
And for any folks who want a bigger overview of this forgotten front, please, of course, check out our back catalog from Season 1, specifically episode number 14, which I think we'll reference a couple of times. It was titled, number 14 was titled Remembering the Canadians at the Battle of Hong Kong, where we I leaned, because I think I wrote that script, I leaned very heavily into the source materials that you were a big contributor to at Canada Company's Je me souviens education program, which is now part of the military history learning program, which, Julien, you play an important role in. Can you please explain to our listeners, first of all, what is Canada Company's military history learning program, and what do you do there?
So basically, the military history learning program, the aim of it is to produce an educational tool, pedagogical tool for teachers in Quebec, but also recently now in Ontario and the rest of Canada, in terms of Canada's own military history. So what we do, and my task here is basically building trial exhibits, virtual exhibits about Quebec's and Canada's various front during the First World War and the Second World War, but also during other military fronts such as the October Crisis or the war in Afghanistan. We also do activities that teachers can do in classes or online with their students. We do lots of stuff. Basically, we have lots of stuff. So check us out on the jemesuviens.org, and also all of our content is free to use for teachers, free to use for everybody.
Free.
So
that's
the
bonus.
that's the key word here. Yeah.
And I understand you had some pretty good success. You've got a couple of 100,000 students in Quebec who've used your materials.
Honestly, this success has been really mind blowing. I'm really happy. We just went to Rivière-du-Loup in December to talk with teachers over there, and we had a lot of positive feedbacks. A lot of people were really welcoming of our content, of our content and everything. Yeah, we're really we had a very good success in the past few years, and we're just, I think, like momentum is just we're just like speaking about momentum and everything.
That's great. Congratulations.
Yeah, that sounds fantastic, and I would encourage all of our listeners to check that out and find out what it's all about. I think it's a wonderful initiative that you're doing there.
Yeah,
Um,
and if you're just like an history fan in general, we also have a section with articles, with like a historical article over there that we just regularly keep it updated. So if you're just interested in Canadian military history, we just have different articles there. So they're also fun to read, I think.
Wonderful.
I've wrote a couple of them, so I think that's fun.
That's always good. That's always good to highlight. So let's move into the Second World War and set the scene for, well, Sea Force, what became known as Sea Force. Julien, by the time World War II begins, the Canadian military environment, though still largely Anglophone, wasn't it? Um, and it offered French Canadians a slightly greater diversity of service beyond the sole infantry units of World War II. The Vandus, for example, the Royal 22nd. So it's not quite as limited as it was back in 1914, 1915, but we're not talking a significant expansion either, are we?
Uh-huh.
But how did this context lead to a Quebec battalion being deployed to the other side of the world in 1941?
So, well, as we explore in the first part of the series, starting in World War II, there was generally greater inclusion of French Canadian within the Canadian Army, and mostly within the infantry unit, which I'm more knowledgeable about. So there was also like a better
Same with us.
initiative.
No bias, no bias here.
No, none whatsoever. It's my to-do list to just read more about the Navy, and eventually the Air Force. But I'm less interested by the Air Force. But that's just me. So there was also like a better initiative to include Quebec's units from Quebec with the rest of the army, probably to avoid a similar scenario that what happens in the First World War, with Conscription Crisis and all of that stuff. You know, so as we mentioned in the first part, in the beginning stage of the war, there was already an inclination to have French-speaking units mixed with English-speaking units for numerous reasons, both logistical, militarily, but also political. And there was this desire to present basically to the rest of the world, to Canada's allies, but also just like in general to the media, to the country itself as well. An army with the same image as the country, so very large, also very united,
Mhm.
and if possible, also bilingual. That'd be like a nice bonus. So this was seen in Europe when the Canadian Army sent its first troops to be garrisoned in Great Britain, but this was also seen in Hong Kong with the formation of the Sea Force. So at its formation, the unit was constituted of mainly two battalions: the Winnipeg Grenadiers from Manitoba and the Royal Rifles of Canada from Quebec. So outside of their military abilities, the message being sent was also of a united country with two completely different units, one from the Prairie, one from
Yeah.
Quebec, who will be working side by side harmoniously and peacefully, and so on and so forth.
Just so we don't confuse the listeners from Quebec, when you said prairie, you don't mean La Prairie, you mean the
No.
prairie.
Yeah, all the various parts of Canada, Quebec and La Prairie, all.
Well, that's a pretty local joke.
Yeah.
So most people are scratching their heads. So
But you'll
Julien,
know it
the
if you know
Royal,
it, yeah.
yeah, exactly. If you know, you know. The Royal Rifles of Canada, was that an official French-speaking unit like the Vandus were in World War One?
No, and really, this is the key distinction. The Royal Rifles of Canada was nominally in English-speaking units. Uh, However, it was actually drawn from a region that was overwhelmingly French-speaking in Quebec, so Eastern Quebec, Quebec cities, but also all the way to Gaspésie. And generally speaking, I will say like the Royal Rifles of Canada occupy the same recruitment zone than the Vendors, yeah, but they were mostly focused, obviously, on the Anglophones that were living in those zones. However, despite that, many French-speaking Canadians also joined that unit for one reason or another. I think for a lot of them it was just like convenience sake. They
Yeah,
will be really
proximity.
interested in being part of the army, and the recruiter will just come to their town and be like, "Yeah, sure, why not?
Yeah,
I speak English already. I'm a bilingual,
right.
Yeah.
or I'm willing to pick it up in the army, like during recruitment." So that's how they will get there. And actually, based on certain reasons that were made, we evaluate that something like 30 to 35% of the soldiers of the Royal Rifles of Canada were primarily Francophones, were primarily French speaking. So they were not a majority, far from it, but they were nonetheless a pretty important proportion of soldiers.
So this would have been French Canada's baptism of fire, wouldn't it? This deployment to Hong Kong in the
Yes,
Second World War, because I mean, who would have thought being deployed across the world to Asia and then the Pacific region? That's not something that comes naturally to the mindset, does it? Quite
exactly.
interesting.
Yeah. And I think like at first, like the idea of the Sea Force was to act as a deterrent against the Japanese army. The Japanese was at this point rapidly expanding itself on the depends of
Yes.
the uh, Western colonies. In 1940, they just invaded Indochina from France. Well, not from, that was posted by French. That what I meant. So, like I said, like the idea of the Sea Force was to act as a deterrent. Their mission was not unlike what we saw with the Canadian garrison in Great Britain. It's just like doing the same thing in Asia, in Hong Kong. And in that sense, fighting against the Japanese army was kind of like the least um, desired outcome of this mission. Unfortunately, it just happened really, really quickly. The Sea Force, I think if I recall correctly, it was supposed like to be the first steps towards like more troops eventually, more, more vehicles, well, they didn't have any vehicles, but vehicles and weapons and stuff like that.
Like the vanguard, so to speak.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. But like I mentioned, like this just happened very, very quickly. The unit was formed at the tail end of September 1941, beginning of October that year. They arrived in Hong Kong in mid-November, and just a couple of days after they arrived, they were already fighting against the Japanese army. So everything just came tumbling down very, very quickly.
So they were formed in September, shipped overseas, and so trained like hardly any training.
No, no. They had a couple of missions. Well, they had a basic training. They also had a couple of missions. I think the Royal Rifles were garrisoned in uh, not Nova Scotia. Terre-Neuve. What is Terre-Neuve again? Newfoundland.
Newfoundland, yeah.
So they garrisoned in Newfoundland for a bit. I think also the Winnipeg Rangers were garrisoned in Jamaica for a bit as well. They didn't see any fightings, obviously. They had some drills, they had some trainings out there, but they haven't really had any fighting experience beforehand.
Wow. That's pretty crazy. And I know we talked about it in episode 14, but it's amazing how this entire front was completely overlooked in our history. Most Canadians aren't even aware that we sent off, thousands of soldiers. And you mentioned vehicles and being a part of the vanguard. If I remember correctly, wasn't their ship sunk on the way over and they didn't arrive with any vehicles?
I think, yeah, no, I think that's the case. I think like a lot of I know like the case in the Canadian vehicles, they were supposed to have them, but I don't remember what happened. You might be right that the ship just got sunk. But this is something that came out a few times when you read testimonials from soldiers. They will be like very, very bitter about the outcome of the battle. They will be like, "You were supposed to have vehicles."
Well, as infantry,
we had this
former infantryers ourselves, we're familiar with that bitterness.
Very, very, very familiar.
What do you mean I got to carry this? Oh, God damn it.
They didn't arrive again.
All right. Well, before we get back to Hong Kong, it's time for our favorite segment. We wish we had a sponsor.
Yes, and today's imaginary sponsor is Kowloon Counter Battery Dark Rum.
Ah, a rum so dark it comes with its own blackout curtain. Notes of molasses, oak, and the faint sound of someone yelling, "Incoming!"
It pairs beautifully with digging in, keeping your head down, and realizing your deterrent mission has become very educational.
Yes, non-deterrent. Kowloon Counter Battery Dark Rum. Best enjoyed responsibly, preferably a sous couvert.
Malheureusement, if they're not paying us. So back to the episode.
There we go. We'll try to get this train back on the tracks.
Yes,
the Japanese, Julien, the Japanese attack came very swiftly. That was the day of infamy, the famous speech by Roosevelt, because the same sort of attack on Pearl Harbor happened on the same day, December 7th, December 8th, depending on the international date line. But it was all part of one big attack. Singapore, Hong Kong, all throughout the Philippines, everything went on the same day. What was the immediate combat experience for the regiment, the Royal Rifles of Canada, and the rest of Sea Force?
In the immediate, I think it's hard to say. The Canadian forces did not immediately engage with the Japanese until they captured the Kowloon Peninsula and they invaded the main island. Not to say that things were obviously peaceful for them. Obviously, they went through the battle, but they were more, I think, if I recall correctly, I think the Royal Rifles, they were more like in the back of the island while the Japanese were like advancing. They did suffer through Japanese artillery. I suspect, I'll have to check that out one day, but I suspect that one of the first casualties in general for the Quebec side of the Canadian Army. But I know like the first casualty of C-Force was Québécois Albert Bilodeau, who was a rifleman from Richelieu, who was injured during a Japanese strike, I think in the very first few days of the battle. Fortunately for him, he survived that strike, but still he was wounded during it. So things changed when the Japanese landed on the main island on December 18, 1941. I won't go into too much details because you guys already made an episode about it. Episode 14, which is available on your favorite podcast platform, so go check it out. But yes, no, the situation was very, very, very dire. Reading testimonials from soldiers, also listening to them, one thing that really struck out to me was how frantic and confusing this battle was. Very few soldiers will actually talk about, like armaments or like military strategy or like tactical advance. They will never use like specific tactical terms. They will also always mention how everything was confusing for them. Everything was just a mix of just running around, shooting, being shot at. It was just very, very confusing and very, very frantic. There were skirmishes that will happen pretty much all over the island in mountainous region, in urban settings, but also like sometimes in the jungle itself, like in a few patches of jungle that were left on the island. So this was just like a very brutal, very difficult battle to be part of, and honestly, just very difficult.
Just
To
chaotic,
tell, I
right?
will
Yeah,
say.
just
As
a
I
bad
Chaotic,
said,
battle.
exactly.
Yeah, yeah.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
just to remind listeners, I mean, we talked about this when we covered the episode or this battle in our earlier episode, that Hong Kong is an island. And what Julien was referring to, Kowloon, the Kowloon Peninsula, leads down towards the island. Then you've got Hong Kong Island. So that's just sort of setting or reminding listeners of the geographical location of it all. And so not only was this French Canada's baptism to battle, this was also Canada's first major land battle of the war,
Yeah.
wasn't it, Julien? Because that also comes as a surprise, I think, to many people who talk about the Second World War and you're familiar with the French front and Canadian forces being deployed to France, but they first saw action here in Hong Kong, and it was brutal and it was swift.
Mhm.
Yeah. And it's worth pointing out that despite the lack of previous battle experience, the Canadians, obviously including French Canadians, really did the best that they could for this battle. Uh, the battle was hopeless, frankly, but the defense was very, very fierce. And one moment that I like to point out is, and I don't recall if you guys already mentioned this in your own episode about the Battle of Hong Kong, but it's the last stand led by the Royal Rifles of Canada in Stanley Village on Christmas Day.
Yeah.
Well, so to go very quickly about, because you guys already talked about it, at this moment of the battle was pretty much over. It was usually just moments away before the governor of Hong Kong would just call for an unconditional surrender of the island. And aside, there was still like a few pockets of resistance led by some British troops and some Chinese troops who were still fighting against the Japanese, but it was very small and very hopeless. And aside from them, there was Company D of the Royal Rifles of Canada, who were pretty much the last big hurdle to the Japanese army. And they were positioned in the Stanley Village. And as some kind of a like last ditch effort, they led one last charge to the Japanese. And I will read Phil Doddridge, which was a rifleman, I think from New Richmond and Gaspésie, who wrote about this charge. It was part of this charge, basically, and he wrote about it in his book, if I can read it. So, because our losses were so heavy, and this was after, basically, he led the charge, and the continued pressure of the overwhelming hordes of Japanese troops, we were forced once again to withdraw. Major Parker turned and counted the ragged remnants of the company, the Royal Rifles of Canada. Of the 120 men who had gone into action in Stanley Village on Christmas Day, only 45 went back up the hills. So
Wow.
the charge itself was disastrous, but I think it just really speaks to how heavy the casualties were for the Canadians and
Yeah.
for the Allies as well during this battle. So, as I mentioned, the colony surrendered very soon after this last charge, and in total, the Allies lost 100% of their men. So,
Yeah.
men being killed, being wounded, but also just being captured,
Prisoner.
becoming prisoners of war. Absolutely devastating. For the Canadian soldiers and the C4s, basically, we had 290 deaths and 493 wounded who occurred during the battle itself. This is without counting the persons who were put in prisoners of war camps who went there until the end of the war and unfortunately got murdered there. And yes, the rest were just captured by the Japanese army. So this was like the first major battle of Canada and for Quebec as well, And was also our first major defeat of the war, unfortunately.
Yeah, I want to come back to that part at the end of the episode because I have a favorite conspiracy theory that I want to kind of bring by you.
Is this kind of podcast that went on?
Well, no, we're typically not a political one or a conspiracy one, but it has always struck me why that the Winnipeg Grenadiers and the Royal Rifle Regiment of Canada were quickly struck off the order of battle after World War II. That can't be any coincidence. Yeah. Long before any other reorgs. Anyway, back out of my conspiracy. I'll take the tinfoil out of my hat and go back in here. But what did Julien? What did the French Canadian soldiers experience in that combat zone? Was it a hindrance? Was it a problem with communications? Did their unique background create any further complications during the battle or afterwards?
Not that I'm aware of. Honestly, I don't recall any testimonials, any mention of that the fact that there were some French-speaking soldiers that there would be considering any difficulties for the comrades or anything like that. I don't recall any major difference during the battle itself. I think the fact that a lot of the Francophones who were part of the Royal Rifles were already bilingual, who already picked up, like they will be recruited, for example, in 1940, they will have time to just pick up some English during deployment and everything. I think that really helped them. As for the imprisonment, I also didn't encounter any difference in terms of the attitudes from the Japanese towards the French or towards the English. For them, they were white, so they will just already be
pieces of shit.
They will just hate them to begin with, regardless if they spoke French or English.
They didn't discriminate in their hatred. That was nice of them.
Yes. Dishonorable surrender is dishonorable surrender as far as they're concerned.
Right, yeah. Like I know, like in some German prisoners of war camps, there were some attempts from the German guards to rile up the Francophones against the Anglophones and stuff like that. There was no such case with the Japanese. They frankly didn't care. The only thing of note that well, honestly, I don't know.
Equal opportunity.
I just find it hilarious.
I don't know if it's on a roll from them or not.
To die. Equal opportunity to die.
The good thing about being in a Japanese prisoner of war camp.
I face no discrimination whatsoever.
Well, at least no discrimination unlike anyone else's discrimination. It was equal discrimination. Yeah, words that have never been spoken. The good thing about a Japanese prisoner of war camp.
You'll only find that here at the Rum Russian podcast.
Exactly. That kind of keen insight.
Yeah, honestly, if I can just finish with that, the only thing of note that I found during the imprisonment of Canadians was that the Francophones were just forced to write the letters in English because the Japanese didn't have any French translators. It was just for them to just be easier to read the letters and to obviously censor them if they were written in English. But besides that, they were brutalized and beat up just the same as their French and as their English comrades. So,
isn't that nice?
There we go.
Well, so there was some discrimination then. You have to write your letters in English.
There you go.
That's it. That was pretty much just an instance. Yeah.
Well, and speaking of censors, now is a good time to pause for the We Wish We Had a Sponsor segment, which everybody...
Well, we do at least. That's right, Rejoy. This episode is brought to you by Write It in English, Censorship Rye.
The rye inspired by bureaucracy at its finest.
Smooth enough that it practically edits itself. One sip and suddenly your entire vocabulary becomes strategically compliant.
Yes, perfect for when you want to express deep feelings, but in the most neutral language possible.
Write It in English, Censorship Rye. Pour, pause, reread, and approve.
I think it's also marketed under boyfriend and husband rye. So...
Do what you're told.
I'm doing it. So, very well done, Colin. Very well done, that one. So let's get back to our narrative. Even as these French Canadian volunteers were fighting and dying, the spotlight back home quickly shifted, didn't it? Julien, why did Hong Kong's sacrifice fail to gain traction in Quebec's public consciousness? I mean, there was absolutely nothing about it, was there?
Oh, exactly. And I think they were a different factor as to precisely why it failed to truly catch Quebec public consciousness. We already quickly talked about this in our last episode together, but I think the first factor was how this battle was covered in Francophone newspapers at the time when the battle was happening and when it concluded. So for this article that I wrote, I analyzed every French newspaper that briefly mentioned Hong Kong and that were published from the end of the battle to, I believe I did it so until like the summer of 1942. And my observation was that the battle was not covered that often to begin with in French media, despite having one battalion from Quebec, and that B, when it was covered, the battle was kind of quickly presented as an event that involved traditional Anglophones institutions, so the British government, the federal government, and the Canadian Army. So a typical article that will be published at the time will cover the battle. They will say what happened and everything like that. They will also mention that it was a British initiative that was held by the federal government and so on. And so they will come mention it. They will mention the Winnipeg Grenadiers. They will mention the existence of the Royal Rifles of Canada. They will mention that it was part of Quebec, but they will very, very mention that a lot of their soldiers were French Canadians. They will never really present this battle as being like, hey, this is Quebec's first involvement in the war. They will just mention, oh yeah, the Royal Rifles were there. Whatever. Uh, Actually, when I did my research, I recall, I think only one or two instances where an article or a news story or like in the Chronicles or anything like that will really highlight the French elements that were part of the battle and that were part of the Royal Rifles of Canada. But besides that, it was very, very Anglophone presenting, if that makes sense. Does that last sentence make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. It does. Yeah.
And in comparison, this was really not the case with the Dieppe raid, which happened in August 1942. So I didn't do like an extensive research. I didn't do like a big comparison between like the number of times Hong Kong was mentioned compared to Dieppe. But when we check out the coverage of the Dieppe raid with other research that were done, the nature of this battle was really quickly captured the consciousness of the Québécois. The French elements, the participation of the Fusiliers Mont-Royal, who was primarily a Francophone unit from Montreal and were unfortunately needlessly sent to their deaths, was really highlighted to the public. Their story was really quickly presented to the public, and I think really catch their imagination much more so than the Battle of Hong Kong and the fate of the Royal Rifles of Canada.
Is it fair to say that the public narrative really focused on the Fusiliers Mont-Royal as a unit that looked and sounded traditionally French Canadian, and Fusiliers Mont-Royal versus Royal Rifles of Canada?
Yeah.
Exactly, yeah, and like mentioned, I think like for a lot of Québécois who read the news at the time will follow the war, I think it was just easier for them to relate to the soldiers of the Fusiliers Mont-Royal than to the soldiers of the Royal Rifles of Canada. Well, to relate, but also to be outraged about their fate. I mean, and I think for that, yes, like you mentioned, like the Anglophone connotation to the Royal Rifles of Canada, but I think just the fact that their French soldiers were not really presented to to begin with, I don't think really helped their case in that regard. And I think also things got muddied a couple of weeks after the battle after the battle had concluded. So what I found during these articles is after the initial report, there was a small campaign with the slogan "Souvenons-nous de Hong Kong," remember Hong Kong, that was like presented in media and it was organized by the Canadian Army. And this campaign, however, was more focused about recruiting and rebuilding the Royal Rifles of Canada instead of just talking about the soldiers who were currently in prison. It was less a campaign about, I don't know, like a publicize, I don't know if it's the right word, but like publicize their stories that were like currently in prison in Asia, but it was more about like recruiting new soldiers. And so I don't think like this really like helped the case for like like
For
to reach the
remembrance. Yeah.
Exactly, yes. Or just commemoration like in the middle of the war.
It's rebuild the battalion type of thing.
Yeah, no, exactly. Yes. And so I think like for the average Francophones, what I'm trying to say is that for the average Francophone who didn't really care about this battle, didn't really care about this unit to begin with, having a campaign about this unit that they want to rebuild, I don't think it was really gonna touch them or was really gonna like connect with them. But also more so like this campaign was carried in English space, which is obvious considering the nature of the regiment. Obviously, they're gonna focus on Anglophone space. So I recall two events in particular that happened during this little campaign. So in February, there was a hockey match that was dedicated to the Royal Rifles of Canada. And this hockey match was carried by Les Arts du Québec, which was this English team from Quebec City. So just reinforcing this identity. And in the same week, there was a concert at the Palais Montcalm in Quebec City, and a certain captain, a certain Gordon Ross, addressed the crowd during this concert to just bolster their spirits and to encourage them to go to the recruitment office and stuff like that.
Join the
So
army.
there were the small events, there were the small initiatives, but really not that much. I don't think the campaign was largely successful for various other reasons. And I think actually the slogan of Remember Hong Kong kind of backfired quickly after, um, because after the campaign was over, the slogan was kind of reappropriated by certain politicians to argue against Canada's greater participation in the war and also to argue against the potential use of conscription.
Ah,
So I found a couple of examples where the slogan "Remember Hong Kong" will be used in that instance. One of them I think was really striking for me is the federal in the National Assembly. There was a representative of Hastings Peterborough who mentioned in the speech that numerous men from his region went to Hong Kong. And when he said that, one of his colleagues from Laval de Montagne, from Quebec, sarcastically exclaimed that, well, if they went to Hong Kong, now I'm in favor of the conscription. Something like, I remember Hong Kong, so now I'm in favor. So this kind of like just a knee-jerk reaction to this speech. There's other examples such as this one, but what really struck me with those is that Hong Kong was, like I said, was used as an argument against the conscription, but the presence of the Francophones within that battle was not really mentioned by the politicians themselves. So they will use it as an argument. They will not really mention that the Francophones were there, which honestly, frankly, will have used their arguments to be quite honest. But I think it's just they didn't use it because they just didn't know, because the media didn't really publicize their presence to begin with. So Remember Hong Kong was used as a slogan in the coming few weeks after the battle concluded, after the month of February as well. But when the Dieppe raid happened, Dieppe became the newest argument to use, and Hong Kong was quickly forgotten, both as an argument but also as a battle, as an event itself, until at least the end of the war.
Right. And if you were Francophone or French Canadian and you were looking to borrow my tinfoil lined hat and talk about conspiracy theories, you could potentially find a grievance in Dieppe where the Fusiliers Montréal were, because of miscommunication, who were part of the reserve force, were sent in late after the battle. It was always looking like the raid was a complete failure. So you could argue that they were needlessly sent in because they were French Canadian to their deaths and their capture and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, there's a lot of grievance there.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's
exactly.
that's understandable, I think. And it's interesting how the political narrative here that was sort of transformed was one of political resistance in terms of conscription, or as Colin, you brought up very very succinctly there, the visible cultural sacrifice, which is Dieppe,
Or
right?
perceived.
Or
Perceived cultural.
perceived. Very well put.
Let's not say it was actually done on purpose.
No, that's absolutely right. So it's a perceived cultural sacrifice, and in Quebec you can see where that's coming from, and this leaves the Quebec Volunteers of the Royal Rifles, which is a nominally English unit. Well, they're left out. It's outside of the defining memory, isn't it?
Yeah, no, that's right. And I think that's the consequence in the long term. So what I covered was mostly the first 2 months after the war, but I think this entire presentation, or this entire perception of the battle, really carried out in the following decades after the battle itself and after the war.
Right. Well, there's nothing like talking about the highly contentious subject of conscription to be the perfect time for once again being irreverent with our We Wish We Had a Sponsor segment.
Absolutely. Pour yourself a glass of Conscription Crisis Canadian rye.
Spicy on the front end, bitter on the finish, and somehow still being debated halfway through the bottle.
Aged in old parliamentary oak, with lingering notes of speeches, slogans, and people talking past each other.
Best served the side of context and a firm reminder that real people paid the price while politics did what politics does.
Yes, Conscription Crisis Canadian rye. It warms you up, but it is divisive.
And since no one's actually paying us, let's get back to the Hong Kong episode with Julien. Julien, when these Francophone and bilingual soldiers returned from the brutal Japanese prisoner of war camps, we had talked about the Kamloops kid and all that good stuff and how brutal he was. How did this absence mémorielle affect them?
So in my paper, I argue that there's an absence mémorielle, so an absence of memory, I will translate it in Quebec, regarding the battle. Again, I speculate that this happened because of two factors. So in one part, the veterans not wanting to speak about their experience, and in another one is that society, well, the Quebec society that is, not being that interested in hearing about them. So for the first part, I think, well, what I think, like, it's a fact that a vast majority of veterans from the Second World War, but also I think from all theaters of war in general, rarely speak about the experience immediately after the war happened, or immediately after the service, at least. It for numerous reasons related to mental health, which I am not at all qualified to talk about or to
It's
explain.
never
I'll
stopped
leave
us.
that to I'll leave that to the professionals on that. There's like very a phenomenon that many veterans chose to be silent about when they went through after their service is over. That's the case for like numerous army, for numerous service and stuff like that. If you're interested, well, not just also veterans, just like in terms of national tragedy, there's a very great book by Henri Rousseau who talks about the Vichy regime, and basically he used the Vichy regime attack, the attitude of the French regarding this regime, regarding the occupation and stuff like that. I think it's called the syndrome de Vichy, the Vichy syndrome, and he used that as an example of like how memories process after several years. And what he talked about is this the repression era of the memory. So when the moment will be the event will be finished, and when people will just kind of stop, well, kind of like repress it in their home until they're willing to talk about it in several years.
Right.
And there's like not really like a process as to how long it's going to take until they're going to talk about it, but just like something's going to happen. But anyway, that's the gist of it, of me trying to explain it in English and without any coffee this morning. So I think what happened is that the Hong Kong veterans kind of went through this process of repression. They went through this tragic battle. They went through 44 months in hell in Japanese POW camps. And we can just really see by their outputs of their testimonials that they really took a long time to talk about their experience for various mental health, various reasons related to mental health. And when they will do so, they will really happen like several decades after the wars. Mostly, I think like the first testimonial already came like I think during the 70s. What a pattern that will usually happen with soldiers, really at least with their testimonial that I read, is that they will come back home, then they will start finding a family, they will start working, they will just go try to have a very normal civilian lives. Their traumas will be kind of like put back in at the back of their heads while they will be dealing with everyday stuff, and when they will retire, most of them than not, then it will just like come back to them. Then it will just be really, really ready to go back to this experience and to talk about them. So this was usually happen, in the 70s and 80s. But what happened is in Quebec, there's this this different context. In the 60s and 70s, there was a rise of liberalism, Quebec nationalism, and a general renewal of the left, which really didn't help any kind of interest from the public population regarding its own Canadian Army as an institution and as an history. So that's the case with a lot of veterans from Quebec, not just from Hong Kong, but just in general. Then when they will be ready to talk about their experience in the war, they will face a society that was just not really that interested to hear about them for reasons. Or they will or just the veteran themselves, they will also kind of feel that they will look at the media, they will look at whatever was going on, we're talking about the 70s, for example, the October crisis or stuff like that. And they just kind of feel like, maybe
Maybe my
maybe I'll just
experience
keep
with
it.
the Royal Rifles of Canada. Maybe I'm not going to
Yeah,
talk
maybe
about
I'll just like
that.
keep it
Maybe
for
I'm not going to go
myself.
down to the FLQ
Yeah,
rally,
yes.
or the PQ
Yeah.
election victory rally in 1976, or the referendum in 1980, and start wearing my Royal Rifles pin.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah.
How do you pronounce that regiment in French?
Well, you don't.
So yeah, I think like honestly, like there's just this different factors. It's just like soldiers like really not talking at first about the experience at length, and when they might have been possibly might have been inclined to talk about it, and maybe being met to a society that was just not really, the society not being ready itself to hear about those stories. So yeah, that's the gist of it basically.
Yeah, and I think also, I mean, with the war in Europe, there was some affinity there with landing on D-Day, freeing France, liberating France, French Canadian soldiers coming back to, so to speak, the motherland from way back when, generations before, but the origin stories are there. So there is a cultural attraction and a pull. But Asia, Hong Kong,
Yeah, no,
Not a
exactly.
lot of
nothing,
connection
right?
between Kowloon and Gaspé.
No. Well,
I mean, they're
there
both,
is the
you know,
peninsula.
Well,
There's the
they're both
peninsula.
peninsula.
by the water. There's hills. A lot of fishing.
Exactly. So I can understand some of that bitterness now. If Quebec society was so indifferent and cold towards their experience, where did these veterans turn to for support and recognition and help?
What I think for the Quebec veterans of Hong Kong, what happens is they just turn into space that will be more welcome to them, or at least they will perceive as being more welcome to them. So the Legion or various other veteran associations. So for the Hong Kong veterans, the Hong Kong Veterans Association, HKVA, which was recently succeeded by the Hong Kong Veterans Commemorative Association, the HKVCA. So this was founded in 1956, and it acted as the primary group where veterans from the Hong Kong veterans could reunite from the Winnipeg Grenadiers, but also from the Royal Rifles of Canada. The HKVA was actually founded by members of the Winnipeg Grenadiers with the objective to nationalize all the smaller associations that were founded at the end of the war. Apparently, such an association existed in Quebec, but I really didn't find any information about it. And I would love to have more information about it because I know it existed from somewhere from 1945 to the foundation of the HKVA in 1956. But I didn't find anything about it. So maybe one day I'll find something about it. But anyway, so the HKVA was, like I said, this idea of running all of the smaller association to just form a bigger one. And the intention of the HKVA was to find reparation for the Hong Kong veterans from the governments, to find monetary recognition, monetary reparation, but also recognition and stuff like that. But at the same time, just by being able to hold meetings, to reunite veterans together, they will also offer a space for them to just talk. To just talk about their experience, to talk about their memories, to talk about the traumas and how to deal with them, to just basically just be a great social space for them to,
Right.
yes, share about the experience and the trauma, but to also just relate to people who also went through the same thing, which is maybe not something that they could experience in the civilian space in Quebec, but also just in general.
So one of those situations where you had to be there to understand,
Exactly. Yes.
kind of thing,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Exactly.
And so how would this marginalization impact the historical documentation of the French-Canadian contribution to the battle?
Well, I think the HKVA kind of acted as a double-edged sword in that regard, in terms of like, yes, it offered like the direct benefit of being a good space for veterans to work and to talk to each other, but it also had the unforeseen consequences of further retrenching them in their own spaces. I don't think this is such a big problem for like the Anglophones veterans, in terms of just being like, being able to better talk to English media, to better talk to the government, because like I said, part of the main task of the HKVA was to seek reparation from the government, and it will do so in English. But although I think for the Francophones one, while they will be in the HKVA, they will obviously talk to the comrades, the friends in English, which wouldn't be a problem for them because they will already be bilingual. But I think it just like better retrench them in their Anglophone space and less so in Francophone ones in Quebec. So when they will come out to the media, they will do so in Anglophones media. When they will talk to government officials, they will do so in English with Anglophones officials majorly. So in Quebec's public consciousness, the existence of the Hong Kong veterans or the HKV in general will just not exist. Will just not be there.
Right.
And this was also happened. Yeah, it was also happened like in their regular activity, but it also happened when it will come. Well, when it will be time to just share their stories, not just within the HKVA, but also to the media or just like in general. So, but I'm sorry, just like trying to check my schedule. So, okay, yeah. So, like in the 1980s, there were like this big push to transmit their stories. The veteran will start to write their memoirs, write books. They will record their testimonials, which I would use extensively for this research. And what they will do for the Quebec veterans is that they will do so, like I said, in the way it will be used to tell them, which will be in English. When you tell a story, you usually like kind of like repeat it. You kind of like build this own script in your own head, and you just be used to retell it the same way.
We do that all the time.
We do that. No,
It's
exactly. No,
mostly the voices that guide us.
no, but I think, oh man, what is it? What is its name? Like when we did the Hong Kong exhibit for Je me souviens, I was not there. This was a couple of weeks before I was hired. But Marina, my boss, talked to one of the last Hong Kong veterans. And when she talked to him, I think it was something like 100 years old. I can't remember his name. But when she will speak to him, you saw like there was a difference between just him speaking normally to her, and but like, when she will ask him about the story, then like the tape would just kind of start rolling.
Yeah.
It's just like it was just like a prepared speech that he was just used to say and to repeat in every occasions for several years. I think what really ticked her off is at one point, like he was 100 years old, but he said something like, "Well, today I'm 80 years old," and blah blah blah. And I think that there was one case of just him being old and just kind of, But I think there was also this idea of like he's just being so used to repeat it that he just kind of even
Yeah.
like revealing his age at the time. So yeah, so I think that's what happened is that for the Quebec veteran, what I'm trying to say is that when it came time to just largely transmit their story, they will do so in a way that they will be used to do so and will be in English. So uh, this is not really the case, for example, of Bernard Castonguay from Montreal. Bernard Castonguay, I think, is one of the more famous Quebec veterans from the Battle of Hong Kong, just because
Yeah.
he was really involved with the HKVA, but he was also very present in the media from the 1980s until his death. Castonguay published his memoir in 2005. He published in French. I think he's the only French Canadian who published something in French regarding his own experience. I remember Tony Banham, honestly, the best historian regarding the Battle of Hong Kong. This man is a walking encyclopedia about this battle and just about the history of Hong Kong in general. He's really amazing. He made us some kind of reports about like how the writings that were published about the Battle of Hong Kong's, and he said something like, "It's really weird that Bernard Castonguay is like the only guy who published something in French, like the only veteran who did so." Like, I'm really surprised that there's not more people that did so. Um, but yeah, but before publishing his memoir in 2005, he also recorded his testimonial for Veterans Affairs Canada in the 1990s, and he did so in English. He did so in excellent English, but he still did so in English. I don't know what's the detail there. I don't know if he had the choice to do it in French or English. I don't know what happened in terms of the recording, but it's possible he just said, I'm with HKVA. I'm used to talk in English with them. I'm used to just
Yeah.
live in English. I'll just do it in English, and
Yeah.
Right.
that's it.
Probably convenience sake or something.
Yeah, exactly. Frankly,
Yeah.
I'm really not blaming the man. I'm not blaming the decision or anything like that. Frankly, I really don't. I don't really care. I just
Yeah.
kind of find it really, really fascinating in that regard. And for me, this really shows how this project of memorial transmission was probably done in English, even by the Francophones itself, which I repeat, it's completely fine. There's really no issues with that. But I don't think it really helped the change of perception in Quebec in terms of the Battle of Hong Kong, which was an event that directly involved Quebec, but in Quebec's consciousness, I think it really happened just
didn't
far
exist.
away.
Just didn't
Exactly.
happen.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Makes it even less relatable than it already was in so many ways.
Yes.
Um, so the perception of this ongoing perception of minimal French Canadian involvement in the Second World War, it isn't just about the numbers who served, but about the political choice of what sacrifice was quote unquote deemed worthy of
Mm.
public memory. It effectively erased a significant contribution, didn't it?
Yeah. No. And Richard Garon, like in the first part that we did together, talk about the involvement of French Canadians
Yeah.
during
Yeah.
World War One and how much bigger and more
Numbers.
diverse
Yeah.
than that was than what we usually learn about. And I think the same can be said of all the veterans of World War Two. So add to that, there is also various outside circumstances that decide determine what will be well known or not. This could be the importance of the magnitude of the event. So, for example, D-Day. Everybody's going to know about D-Day because
Yeah.
just how massive this was and how influential and how impactful it was.
And Hollywood has
Uh,
made a lot of movies about it too.
and
So
Hollywood made a lot of movies about it. So that obviously everybody's going to know about D-Day. But also an event could be known because of how it was covered, by the media, but also by historians afterwards. But it can also be known because of how it was transmitted thereafter. S- So outside of the Battle of Hong Kong, Quebec's participation in the Pacific Front or in Asia is also much more extensive than we currently know about. There was the Battle of Hong Kong, but we can also talk about our own participation in the Aleutian campaigns in Alaska.
yeah,
We
yeah,
also, I think we also had some soldiers that were in
Regiment de Hull.
Yeah, regiment Earl, exactly. We also had some Quebec elements, not necessarily soldiers, but civilians, people who were, in China, who immigrated in Quebec afterwards, were in China during the war. There were also people in Myanmar or in India and
Yeah.
stuff like that.
Yeah.
Military speaking, yes, the Battle of Hong Kong was our biggest contribution, but there's also like a much more extensive presence of Quebec in the Pacific War. Honestly, just a matter of researching it and presenting it. Maybe someday we're just gonna we'll be more aware of it.
It's a good project. It's a good project to consider because you're absolutely right. And I think we're all talking at the beginning of the episode how we're all guilty of, being more army biased, and we can't forget the contribution. I mean, Royal Canadian Air Force was active in the Pacific. Royal Canadian Navy would have been contributing to convoys and escort duties and all these things, but because they don't necessarily work to do in units, i.e., you're on a certain plane or a certain ship, it's not the same sort of attachment as a regiment and a regimental lore and the way it continues to exist. I don't think a lot of those stories have really come to the surface. And I don't think they would have had, certainly in World War II, I don't think they had any exclusively French-speaking ships or French-speaking air. They would have had some aircraft, but not because you had the Alouette Squadron and other things. But wow. Yang, thank you so much for detailing this vital yet, well, let's face it, painful chapter in Quebec's military history. I think by focusing on Hong Kong, you've shown that the fight for French-Canadian visibility didn't end on the battlefield. It continued as a fight for remembrance, more importantly, on the home front.
Yeah, you said it so well there, Colin. I mean, this episode has shown us that French Canadian soldiers were absolutely willing and full participants in the Second World War, achieving the extraordinary against impossible political and institutional odds.
Yeah, thank you, Julien, for explaining this tragic and, let's face it, pretty much entirely overlooked part of our history. The sacrifice of the Canadian volunteers at Hong Kong in World War II is completely unknown by most people, and the fact that there was a large percentage of whom, about a third, you say, of the Royal Rifles were French-Canadian, well, we hope to have helped shatter the myth of, quote, unwilling Francophone, unquote.
Yeah, absolutely. And we do have one more episode coming up on our series on the French-Canadian military experience, where Richard Garon will be coming back
Speaking of unwilling Francophones. See if I can edit that out. He's going to beat me up.
Well, hopefully he will be coming back on the Rum Russian podcast to explain his groundbreaking research, which challenges the traditional views of French-Canadian participation in the First World War.
I'll make sure we release this one after we record with Richard. So myth busting. We love it. Thank you, folks. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share with your friends and family. And until next time, cheers to history.
Cheers to history.